Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Look, I know what you're thinking. Ronnie, one quote from former Democratic United States Senator of Connecticut, Joseph Isidore is adorable, nasty daddy Lieberman, is great and all, but this is September, and I feel like I need to. Well, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, I want you to know that I hear you. I may not understand you. If I'm being quite frank, I have absolutely no idea what the connection between Joe Lieberman and the month of September is, but I'm always here to fulfill your desires, no matter how made up by me they are. So, quote, the player may then choose a method of murder ranging from ripping the heart out to pulling off the head of the opponent with the spinal cord still attached, end quote. Now, Joe is clearly talking about the original Mortal Kombat, a video game that he was none too fond of. And I will say, you didn't exactly choose a way to murder your opponent. In fact, in a pre-extensively available internet world, the task of finding the exact combination of moves and buttons that would unlock a fatality was no easy task. That notwithstanding, our old buddy Joe isn't really pushing so far into the sensationalism on this one. It is hard to articulate what it was like being of a certain age in the early 90s and seeing Mortal Kombat by chance for the first time at your local arcade or 7-Eleven or laundromat, or in my case, a video rental store, a place called Video Vision in Moreno Valley, California. Real people for the first time with blood flying everywhere, seeing fatalities, which, by the way, weren't like an advertised thing or anything. So when that background went dark, especially as a kid, it was like, what the ever-loving fuck is about to happen? And then it happened, exactly like Joe describes. Or, on one level, you can even send your opponent plunging into a pit of spikes. It was undeniably the dawn of a new age in video games. And that new age would be fucking violent. But one of the most shocking elements of this whole circus was the fact when a film based on the movie was greenlit, it would be rated PG-13. Now, I get it. The film's fan base at the time was predominantly preteens and teenagers, and an R rating would have slashed the ability of its fan base to get into the theater. I know I wouldn't have been able to watch, which would have undoubtedly led to some top-tier pouting on my part. All that being said, to paraphrase a certain advertising campaign for a Kubrick adaptation of a certain literary classic, hear more in episode 22 of this very podcast, Lolita, how did they ever make a PG-13 movie of Mortal Kombat? But the real shock, the thing that absolutely blows my mind to this very day, the fact that has plagued scientists, philosophers, and religious leaders alike. Not only did they make this PG-13 Mortal Kombat, but it is a goddamn masterpiece. Just fucking fantastic. It works perfectly. None of this is my opinion, by the way. All of these are facts, and if you disagree, you are not only objectively incorrect and morally bankrupt, but I feel sorry for you and your sad life and the ugly world you live in. No small factor in the success of the Mortal Kombat movie is the equally classic soundtrack. Not only was there timeless originals created by the film's composer, George S. Clinton, no relation to George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic fame, which I found out at an embarrassingly late age, but it also had songs from the likes of Napalm Death, Orbital, KMFDM, Typo Negative, Fear Factory, and Gravity Kills. But one of the most iconic of these was the instrumental song that accompanied the Liu Kang versus Reptile fight. It was a song called Control by what I thought was a band called Traci Lords. It is an absolute banger, a 90s techno wet dream. So imagine my surprise when I would find out years later that not only did the song Control have lyrics, but Traci Lords wasn't some weird Euro techno band a la Daft Punk. She was one and the same as the actress and former adult film star that almost took down the whole adult industry when it was discovered that she was underage. Which, sure, is an incredible story filled with mystery against a background of a new age of the porn industry. That's all well and fine. But why is nobody talking about the brilliant song Control and the rest of the tracks off her flawless 1995 debut album, 1000 Fires? Is it a super controversial or infamous album? No. Does it fall outside the general purview of what we generally cover on this show? Yeah, probably. Does it probably make more sense to go back to that part I mentioned about child porn and the adult film industry almost toppling? Fine. But let's hop into the trigger warnings because I've already mentioned underage porn twice and I'm already feeling the ick. So let's make sure we stay on the same page. The trigger warnings for this episode are that we will be talking about underage pornography, statutory rape, and the rape of a very young minor. I know, that's a doozy of a trigger warning towards the end there, but I think we can get through it together. Or, as always, not. Just a friendly reminder, this podcast is not here to fuck up your day. If you ever feel the need or the want to take an episode off, do it. We're all friends here. The door is always open. This isn't Cannibal Holocaust or a Serbian film. Gatekeeping bullies are officially banned from saying that you aren't a real fan if you don't listen to the worst bits. Now, with all that being said, I feel I do need to throw in a bit of a disclaimer here. So, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, all of my beautiful, amazing people under the non-binary umbrella, welcome to the disclaimer. That's right, the disclaimer. Bonus points if that immediately reminds you of The Offspring and or Jello Biafra. All that being said, it is well worth noting that Traci Lords told her story in her own tell-all 2003 autobiography, Underneath It All. And this is where the disclaimer truly kicks in. For reasons we won't be delving into too deeply on this episode, it would seem that as a reference for the truth of what happened, that book in particular is not a particularly good resource. It is far from a steaming pile of lies or a fever dream of a narcissist or anything along those lines. But based on the words of various other folks in her life and in the industry, it seems that her memoir falls short in terms of accuracy to exactly what happened, how, and why. I'm not even saying don't read the book or that it has no value. Just do so with a grain of salt, as we are doing within this episode, to make sure we do our best to present the realities of the subject as best we can. For more information about the many sides of the Traci Lords story and the quest to untangle them all and find the truth behind it, I highly recommend the Once Upon a Time in the Valley podcast by Lily Analik and Ashley West, which a good deal of my research leaned on for this episode. It is an amazing series and a must for anybody looking to hear more about Traci Lords. I bring all of this up only to say that in a world where femme-presenting folks are routinely sexually assaulted with all too often little to no consequence for the predator of said sexual assault, it is at the very least a bad look to be dismissive of a book where a woman chronicles her abuse. So I will say this. to be able to proceed in what I hope is the fairest, most honest, and responsible way forward. It is true that Traci Lords' book is flawed. This does not necessarily make her a liar or flippant about the abuse she suffered. It certainly doesn't mean that she is in any way some sort of cunning pathological siren using a victim complex trope. And even if all of that were the case, which again, I stress, it is not, it absolutely does not mean that femme-presenting folks do not deserve our sincere attention and trust and confidence when an incident of sexual assault has been brought to our attention. And now, with all that being said, let's take it back to the mid-1980s. Now, the Banned Media Podcast is no stranger to talking about pornography, but when we do, we tend to stick around what some would call the porn chic era, or the golden age of porn. This being in the 70s and early 80s. If you remember Debbie Does Dallas, a film deserving of a two-parter episode of this very podcast, it was released in 1978, and much of this was due to the hard-fought indecency lawsuits of the film Deep Throat. Long story short, Deep Throat, which will definitely get its own episode, opened the floodgates of making porn that you wouldn't be arrested for either making or consuming. Where before Deep Throat, most adult films were forced into pretending to be solely for the purposes of education. A post-Deep Throat world would allow story and, just as importantly, sex for sex's sake. Now, to be sure, the effects of this were felt across the country. Porno was in, and independent filmmakers of all stripes were answering the call. It became very common practice, in fact, that you would learn how to make films either anonymously or with a fake name on the set of a porno flick. Fun fact, Freddy Krueger creator himself, the masterful Wes Craven, earned his chops directing a porno called The Fireworks Woman under the fake name Abe Snake. But the undisputed meccas of this new gospel of the hardcore, in terms of both production and exhibition, were New York, home to the likes of Gerard Damagno, the director of the aforementioned Deep Throat fame, and one of my own personal favorites, the spectacular The Devil and Miss Jones. This was also well before Rudy Giuliani, then mayor of New York, would come about and clean up Times Square by running out all the sex clubs and porno theaters, with wanton disregard for the communities and cultural relevance that the queer community had built there, all to throw in some chain restaurants. But arguably an even bigger mecca was San Francisco, California, home of the infamous Mitchell brothers, Jim and Artie. Now, these crazy motherfuckers probably deserve their own episode, but suffice it to say, not only did they bring us the super arty 1972 classic Behind the Green Door, but also the O'Farrell Theater, which Fear and Loathing Hunter S. Thompson himself would go on to christen, quote, the Carnegie Hall of public sex in America, end quote. Even Dianne Feinstein would say that the porno industry, quote, has spread so drastically in San Francisco that we may have become a kind of smut capital of the United States, end quote. Now, you may think that I love pornography, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, and you would be right, but apparently not like Dianne Feinstein loves pornography. Just don't tell her I said that. I don't want her to be mad at me. But, as Bob Dylan says, the times they are changing. Now, hopefully you never become so old at heart, stuck up, or cynical that you forget that porno films are indie cinema, not only because of their low budgets, but because both operate outside the systems that make up the mainstream movie business. And personally, I think both, at their best, share that rebel spirit of not liking to be told what they can do. So when a new technology started showing up on the market, so too came a new breed of filmmaker This new technology was videotape. And yes, maybe it does feel stupid to say that like it's cool in the year of our Lord 2023, but not only did it revolutionize the consumer end of filmmaking, with the VCR, people could take their favorite movies home to watch for the first time, or maybe, just maybe, be given access to adult material for the first time without having to brave the seediness of an adult theater, assuming their own town even had an adult theater. But also with the video camera, it became exponentially cheaper and easier to make movies. Maybe at the cost of the picture quality, but for some movies, it's more about what you were seeing than how fancy it looks. With the giant hurdle of unaffordable specialty equipment and film stock out of the way, a new generation of pornographer came to shine. With even smaller budgets and capability of creating just insane amounts of content. And the undeniable home of this new wave of video vixens was the San Gabriel Valley, just east of Los Angeles, better known as the Valley, in no small part due to its Goldilocks-esque distance from Los Angeles and the beach. The Valley was far enough away to be rooted firmly outside the grasp of the institutions and regulations of mainstream Hollywood, but also close enough to take advantage of the throngs of beautiful people that flock to Hollywood in order to take their shot at the life of a superstar. Also close enough to the beaches to take advantage of the West Coast phenomenon that was the beach babes. A very Californian beauty standard of being blonde, tanned, skinny, and big-chested. A prototype that still lives on to this day, and one that would be forever immortalized in the Katy Perry song California Girls off the album Teenage Dream in 2010, with lines like, quote, "You can travel around the world, but nothing comes close to the Golden Coast," end quote. Quote, "Sex on the beach, we don't mind sand in our stilettos," end quote. And the ever popular, quote, "sun-kissed skin so hot will melt your popsicle," end quote. This was the social background when a 15-year-old Redondo Beach resident by the name of Nora Louise Kuzman, though soon to be known much better as Traci Lords, sat in the Sherman Oaks office of one Jim South in February of 1984. Jim South was a modeling agent and recruiter, and while he did not work exclusively with the porn industry, he did work extensively with it. Though it should be noted that there was a third person in the room, a man who has actually been given several fake names, and very few know the real one. We will call him by the alias given to him in Traci Lords' book, Roger Hayes. Roger Hayes was the ex-boyfriend of Traci's mom and her one-time father figure, who had a penchant for selling and abusing cocaine and molesting Traci in her sleep. Traci was in the office on her own volition after having answered an ad for an adult model in a local magazine. Having been given a ride there by Roger Hayes and armed with an actual government-issued ID, specifically a driver's license under the name Christy Elizabeth Newsman that Roger Hayes had helped her procure. In fact, of the three people sitting in that room, Jim South was the only one who didn't know Traci was only 15 and not 20 like her driver's license stated. A quick note about Jim South, or Tim North, as he's called in Traci's autobiography, which, by the way, Tim North as an alias for Jim South absolutely tickles me. There is a probably not completely unearned stereotype that comes to mind when one thinks about a porn recruiter. The idea usually embodies some sort of sexual deviant with less than scrupulous intentions that at best adheres to the law that he's bent and perverted to its absolute max And at worst, well, there's no end to the number of nightmare scenarios a person like that could facilitate. And while people like this may well have existed and probably exist to this day, by almost all accounts, this is not Jim South. Jim came from the insurance world, having sold insurance in Texas until he moved to California in 1968. He was a husband and a father and kept all of his dealings strictly professional and had a no dating policy with all of his clients. He would often caution his clients against drug use and abuse. Not terrible advice for the so-called snowstorm that was cocaine in the 1980s, especially in the Los Angeles entertainment industry. Many of the women who he represented remembered him fondly as almost a father figure, a role he very much admits to filling. It went so far that the only time he made any of the girls he represented uncomfortable is if he ended up on set, because it felt weird to have a father figure see them engaged in sex acts. Luckily, this was rarely the case because he never went to set to watch, but would occasionally show up on set to work on some business with the producers of whatever was being shot. Traci claims in her book that Jim left a line of cocaine for her to loosen up before he left the room so she could get dressed and take some routine Polaroids. And that this is the first time she did cocaine. Given his well-attested to track record for not only treating the models he represented with professionalism, but also his strong stance against the use of drugs, this claim is most probably not true. In fact, if there were cocaine ingested by Traci that day, the almost undeniable source would have been from Roger Hayes, who you will remember is a cocaine dealer, probable molester of a young Traci, and is actively assisting her in concealing her age so that she can shoot pornography at the wholly too young and illegal age of 15. There is no telling of this story in which Roger Hayes is not only a bad dude, but an out-and-out monster. Back to the meeting, though. Jim South gives his spiel to Traci, a memorized speech he gives to all his clients explaining exactly what the job entails and what they could expect to get paid for doing what at what levels. It is a speech that was captured in the 1985 documentary Fallen Angels, and, if nothing else, is completely transparent and gives little to no room for interpretation. He snaps some sexy Polaroids for the publicity purposes, and after she signs the contract, a star is born. She started off doing magazines such as Jugs, Velvet, and Club. She even posed in Penthouse's 15-year anniversary issue, which, by the way, was the first time she dropped the fake name of Chrissy Nussman and adopted the stage name Traci Lords. It was soon after this that she would do her first adult film, What Makes Me Hot. A title so hot it needed an exclamation point after it. Now, this is again an area of Traci's biography that has differing accounts, so I'll just do my best to lay out what isn't contested. Traci was hired that day to be in a porno film, but in a one-line part that was completely clothed. And by completely clothed, I mean in a bikini for a pool party scene. Traci does her thing and is wrapped and is free to leave or hang out if she wants. She decides to stay for a bit and hangs out in the kitchen. It is here she bumps into one of the film's male leads, Tom Byron. The two hit it off. They start having unscripted sex in the kitchen, and eventually the cameras show up. And just like that, Traci is shooting her first hardcore sex scene. Just for the record, the bit that varies between parties is whether or not and to what level Traci was intoxicated and how consensual the cameras showing up were. Now, while we aren't here to solve that mystery, one thing that was undeniable was Traci was an absolute force to be reckoned with this new age of sun-kissed, bleach blonde video vixen. It wasn't long before she was starring in films across the entire landscape of the beaded back rooms of your local mom and pop video rental store, the one illuminated by red lights and adults only signs. America still blissfully unaware that the minor they should have been worried about crossing that barricade was the one on the cover of the VHS tapes. That year alone, she would feature in What Gets Me Hot, The Sex Goddess, Talk Dirty to Me Part 3, Sister Dearest, and in what would become an incredibly problematic title that would later come to bite filmmakers square in the ass, Those Young Girls. Which, just to throw salt on an open wound, the name of Traci Lords' character in that movie was in fact Traci. Not too shabby for only having started doing films somewhere around September of that year. 1985 would be her most prolific year in the adult industry because it would be the only full year she spent in the adult industry. Just a small sampling of the many, many movies she made that year include the fabulously titled The Adventures of Tracy Dick, The Case of the Missing Stiff, an obvious Dick Tracy parody, Black Throat, an interracial take on the classic Deep Throat that went on to win Best Video of the Year at the X-Rated Critics Organization Awards, Hollywood Heartbreakers, in which she shares the small screen with fellow new wave porn sensations Amber Lynn, Peter North, and my second favorite hedgehog, Ron Jeremy, Kinky Business, a parody of the Tom Cruise classic Risky Business, which would go on to win the AVN Award, short for Adult Video Network, basically the Oscars of pornography, for the best couple scene, and most notably, the Dark Brothers classic New Wave Hookers, the first installment of a long series of 6 sequels and a remake that collected countless awards along the way. And by countless, I mean more than I feel like counting. It's like 8 movies. But I will say, the first one alone won the Best Erotic Scene, the Best Musical Score, and the Best Trailer Erotica Awards from the Adult Film Association of America. It was also nominated for Best Art and Set Decoration, Best Cinematography, Best Costume Design, and Best Advertising Campaign. It also won the Adam Film Award Guide Award for Best Movie and is included in the X-Rated Critics Organization Hall of Fame and ranked number 17 of AVN's 101 Greatest Adult Films of All Time. Also, fun fact, Part 6 starred Tracy Valentines and had a character named Dr. Stinky Pinky, which I think is just as much of an accomplishment. Keep in mind this is just a small sampling, and it doesn't even begin to mention all the compilations her scenes would find themselves in. 1986 would only see 3 films starring the now not-so-adult superstar. That would be Tracy Takes Tokyo, Beverly Hills Cop You Later, and Tracy I Love You. Of this little trilogy, the most important by far would be Tracy I Love You. And that is because of the events that it is sandwiched in between. Just before filming, Tracy turned 18, making this her first legal adult film. Shortly after it finished, the news broke the fact that she had been under 18 for the rest of her career, making Trace I Love You not only her first legal adult film, but now officially her only legal adult film. So, who ratted out Tracy? Well, long story short, we just don't know. Don't worry, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold. I will make a slightly longer story out of that. But before any of that, we need to look at how this all went down. It was May of 1986 when authorities were apparently tipped off that Traci Lords was not who she claimed to be, or more importantly, not when she claimed to be. Okay, look, they can't all be winners. More importantly, she was not the age that she said she was. The news would break to the public on July 17th, 1986, and threw the adult film industry into an immediate and necessary state of emergency. Here are 3 facts that unleashed on the country seemingly overnight. 1. Hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who, under normal circumstances, would have had nothing to do with child pornography, just found out that they had either seen, rented, or worst case scenario, owned exactly that. 2. More than a handful of adult entertainers, and reportedly others in the industry, I mean they can't all be Jim South, had found out that they were unwittingly guilty of statutory rape. And 3, the adult industry was now sitting on countless copies of its hottest commodity that not only needed to be stopped from production and distribution, but destroyed for ethical and legal reasons. Also, all the adult rental shops and theaters needed to do the same thing. The fallout from the revelation did not only shake the adult world as we knew it, it came very goddamn close to destroying the whole thing. According to the adult actor Bill D., which, by the way, should be noted that Wikipedia expressly warns is not to be confused with Billy D. Williams of Star Wars fame. But according to Billy D., quote, "They say in the straight world, it's where were you when JFK got shot. In the adult world, it was where were you when you found out Traci Lords was underage." End quote. And it does seem to be the case across the adult industry that legitimately nobody knew. Not like an open secret, not like a don't ask, don't tell scenario or a nudge, nudge, wink, wink type thing. There was across the board shock when this news broke. So law enforcement took Traci into protective custody and began to knock down the door of all the people she associated with, even searching the offices of our old friend Jim South. Make no mistake, financially, this was devastating. A recall of this nature in the 1980s cost the still burgeoning industry millions. Also, say what you will of porn moving from film to videotape, but undoubtedly bringing adult material out of the seedy adult theaters and into the privacy of our own living rooms gave a shielding from moral crusaders that it had not previously enjoyed. That flies right out the fucking window when porn finally gains mainstream headline front page status, but it's for child pornography, and how there is a good chance that you might be guilty of watching it. But the biggest ramification was the legal one. Everyone involved in this, in even the smallest way, was looking at the very real possibility of prison, and not for an insignificant amount of time. To add even more shit into this already Barnum & Bailey greatest show on earth size shit show, only 2 days prior to this, the Meese report had dropped. Now, we've talked about the Meese report before on this podcast, perhaps most appropriately on the Debbie Does Dallas episode. But just as a reminder, the Meese report, or as it was officially called, the final report of the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, although as many editor will tell you, never throw the word final into your naming scheme. It never is. The Meese report is a 1,960-page attempt to take down pornography in the United States, ordered by none other than the very serious cowboy actor turned president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, to appease his evangelical, pearl-clutching, freedom-hating, moral majority base. It should be noted that me and Ronald Reagan's stance on what constitutes morality is about as far apart as our statuses of not being dead. Also, it missed absolutely nobody's radar that one of the films she made was called Those Young Girls. Now, you can imagine with this many players involved and the absolute grand scale of all of this, this was what legal experts would commonly refer to as a big old clusterfuck. but they would say it in Latin to seem smarter than me. So, if we zoom out a little bit and take a look a little farther down the road of time, we see that most parties involved were able to avoid serious legal repercussions, on charges related to Traci anyway, as is sometimes the case when certain government agencies can't bust you for one thing, the IRS comes a-knocking. All that being said, the key point that saved the asses of so many actually had to do with two of Traci's last 3 adult films, Traci Takes Tokyo and Traci I Love You. Traci Takes Tokyo was shot on location in Japan. Traci I Love You was shot on location in Paris, France. Now, my geography may not be the greatest, but I can tell you that not only are Tokyo and Gay Paris outside of Southern California's San Gabriel Valley, but they are also, in fact, outside of the United States altogether. And even way, way back in the 1980s, you needed a passport to do that. A passport that Traci Lords had. One that she had officially acquired from the U.S. government. Having done so using the exact same identification she used to convince the adult industry that she was 20. It was also of note that her California ID was also given to her by the government. While Traci had certainly obtained the IDs through fraudulent means, none of them were fake. She had a birth certificate, California driver's license, and U.S. passport, all under the name Christy Nussman. The real Christy Nussman was an acquaintance of Roger Hayes. You remember him, the fake name of the piece of garbage that willfully and willingly got someone who viewed him as a father figure involved in being an underage porn star. Chrissy had given Traci the birth certificate in an effort to help her open up Traci's job opportunities to things like a waitress at an all-night cafe, not child porn star. That was solely Roger Hayes' kick. And as the government itself had fallen for the ruse of Traci being 5 years older than her actual age, both in issuing driver's license and the passport, it was going to make it very hard to prove that the folks in the adult industry had any chance of knowing that she was underage. So at the end of the day, that leads about a dozen theories of who ratted Traci out. The one that has gained some of the most steam is that it was Traci herself, that she had indeed planned it since day one to enter the industry, cause as much of a commotion as she could, and then tip off the authorities, essentially turning all that porn she had made into contraband, erasing her on-camera past and leaving behind only one adult film, which was legal to own, Traci I Love You, which, conveniently to some, was in fact owned by her own newly formed company, TLC, or the Traci Lords Company. And while there is a lot to be said about this theory on the surface, it certainly has the most intrigue of all the theories. I don't really think it holds water once you start to dive into it. Firstly, by all accounts, Traci was and is a tenacious, intelligent go-getter who has never lacked ambition. All that being said, the level of cunning that a plan like this requires is nearly unheard of in any 15-year-old kid, even the multi-talented Traci Lords. Also, you can hear part of that tenacity in interviews she gave around the time she founded TLC about how she wanted to elevate direct-to-video pornography. Well, dear listeners, friends if I may be so bold, I have seen Traci I Love You. And it's not good. In fact, it's kind of bad. Now, admittedly, I have nothing to compare it to. Traci I Love You is the only adult film I have seen from Traci Lords because it's the only one that you can watch in a legal, moral, or ethical sense. I know this doesn't need be said, but if you will just indulge me, I will say it all the same. Do not seek out Traci Lords' back catalog where she is underage. That is child pornography, clear and simple. And child pornography is bad. and you are a bad person if you hunt it down. All that being said, I Love You, Traci doesn't match up to some of the B movies she starred in just post this whole ordeal, and it certainly doesn't come close to some of the winning adult films that she was in before the bust, including the classic New Wave Hookers, which thankfully, after it was recalled, were re-released with Traci Lords cut completely out of the films and a new poster featuring Ginger Lynn. I guess the point I'm getting at is, if this all was planned out and she did intend to leave behind only one film, why would it have been that one? Other theories include it was her boyfriend / business partner at TLC that had ratted her out, that she was in danger from the mob, a scorned Roger Hayes, which, while not likely, I guess all fall under the realm of possible. The one thing that does make sense to me, though it is important to admit I certainly have an anti-government bias, is that the government had known for a while that this young starlet was underage. 2 anonymous sources have even come forward and said they reported Traci's underage status to the DA back when she was still doing magazines, and they were told that there was nothing the DA could do about it. The government was simply biding their time, waiting for the Meese report to drop so that her story could have the most impact and help with the anti-pornography push that the Reagan administration was plowing forward with full steam at the time. And while that makes the most sense to me, admittedly the world may never know, but allow me to once again point you in the direction of Once Upon a Time in the Valley. The link will be in the show notes, where they do an exhausting search for the truth of the whole matter. Also, what was the reason that Traci needed a job so bad that she was willing to acquire a stranger's birth certificate? Well, life had not been easy for that young girl, but for that, we're going to have to take it all the way back before Traci Lords or Christy Nussman, all the way back to when her whole world knew her as Nora Louise Kuzma. Nora Louise Kuzma, or Traci Lords, which is what we will continue to call her, was born in Steubenville, Ohio on May 7th, 1968. She hated Steubenville. To her, it was a dead-end hick town, well deserving of its nickname, Stupidville. Her dad was plagued by alcoholism and took it out on Traci's mom. Even after they would eventually split, he still haunted Traci's mom, even going so far as to beat her in front of Traci's grandmother's house where they were staying at the time. The reason? He found out that she had started to date a black guy. It should also be noted that he dispersed this beating in full view of Traci, who was looking out her grandma's window. Eventually, Traci's mom would find a new, slightly older boyfriend who would pack up Traci, her mom, and her sisters and drive them off into the sunset away from her father and towards the fabled beaches of Southern California. Unfortunately, the man in question was Roger Hayes. Life in California was undoubtedly a better match for Traci, but still her troubles persisted. At the age of 10, she was raped by her 16-year-old quote-unquote boyfriend. It is worth noting that her own sister made the claim that the rape never happened, though she never offers up one iota of evidence for why she said that this is the case. So even though Traci's autobiography has a less than stellar track record, I honestly see no reason not to believe Traci on this one. When Traci was 15, she got pregnant by her boyfriend. Afraid of how her mom would react, she sought out help from Roger Hayes to get an abortion. Her relationship with her boyfriend at that time would never recover. It was about this time that she answered that fateful ad and caught a ride out to the valley. And this is where the history of Traci Lords began. But it's important to remember that it's not where it ends. It doesn't even end a few years down the road when she is exposed for being a minor. Traci Lords is active in various creative endeavors to this day at the ripe young age of 55. After all is said and done, Traci Lords still holds the honorific of underage porn star Traci Lords, which I get. That's what landed her on this podcast, after all. But we don't have to forget that part of her history to also incorporate some of the many, many other achievements she has done in her career. Achievements that, mind you, were not made by an underage girl trying to escape a shitty life by entering a world that she had absolutely no business being in. And for as mature as she looked or acted, it doesn't change the fact that this was an extremely unhealthy place to be for a scared little kid. In the years since, she has managed to become Traci Lords the actress in B-movies like Jim Wynorski's Not of This Earth, Shock 'em Dead and Raw Nerve, more mainstream flicks like Virtuosity and Blade, and the John Waters films Serial Mom and the cult classic Crybaby. And, ironically enough, Kevin Smith's Zack and Miri Make a Porno. Also, Traci Lords the author, having made her own autobiography. Traci Lords the activist for the LGBTQIA community and against child and teen homelessness. And maybe, just maybe, Traci Lords the musical genius behind one of the best goddamn techno albums of the 90s, 1000 Fires, which included the phenomenal track Control, whose instrumental version is featured in the soundtrack for the first goddamn Mortal Kombat movie. Fun fact, no one will change my mind about this. And final fun fact, I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. We got a Patreon now, so if you want to directly support the show, please go check it out over at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. Also, feel free to find us on all the socials, but TikTok is where I'm most active, at BandRonnie. Please like, comment, and share, but if you really want to help the podcast out, tell your friends about us. That way, we can all be friends. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.